I didn't gasp or shout. I just sat there in my car, engine ticking softly, hands resting on the steering wheel, and thought, so this is how he's decided to do it. If you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or betrayed by someone who thought you'd stay silent, this story is for you. Don't blink. Don't skip. What happens next changes everything. The sun said it was 3:17 p.m., that late afternoon hour when the air smells like hot dust and oil, and everything feels a little exposed. I noticed the gate camera light blinking, steady and patient the way I'd set it months ago. The warehouse sat at the edge of town, same as always, low and wide and forgettable. That was the point. He was hunched over the padlock, bolt cutters biting down with a sharp metallic snap that carried farther than he expected. He flinched, then laughed to himself like the sound didn't matter. Like no one was listening. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the one that shows up before a bad memory. I reminded myself to breathe. In through the nose. Out slow. At my age, panic only steals time, and time was something I'd learned to guard carefully. I checked my phone without unlocking it, just enough to see the notifications waiting, quiet and lined up. Everything was where it should be. He hadn't seen me yet. He never looked behind himself. That was always his flaw. He was wearing the brown jacket he liked, the one he put on when he wanted to look official, like he belonged somewhere. Sweat darkened the collar. The truck he'd parked crooked by the fence wasn't his usual one. Different plates. I made a mental note, the way I taught myself to do years ago, back when noticing details felt like survival. The cutters hit the lock again. This time it gave. The sound wasn't loud, but it was final. Metal falling to concrete has a way of landing inside your bones. He kicked the broken lock aside with his boot, impatient, already reaching for the door handle. I thought of my father then, his careful handwriting, the way he used to double-check everything, even grocery lists. He would have hated this kind of carelessness. I opened my car door. Creaked louder than I wanted. He froze. The warehouse door stayed closed between us, a thin line of shadow at the bottom. For a moment neither of us spoke. The wind pushed a scrap of paper across the lot. Somewhere nearby, a train horn sounded, long and low, the afternoon sliding toward evening. "You're a long way from home," I said. He turned slowly, surprise flashing across his face before he rearranged it into something smug. He always did that, like emotions were furniture he could move around if he tried hard enough. "Didn't expect to see you," he said. "Thought you were out of state." I replied. My voice sounded steady to my own ears, which felt like a small victory. "Plans change." He glanced past me toward the road, then back at the door, calculating. I could almost see the math running behind his eyes. "Your mother said this place was unused," he said. "Figured I'd check on it. Lock was old." "That lock was doing its job," I said. He shrugged, lifting the cutters slightly as if they were an afterthought. "Family shouldn't keep secrets," he said, and smiled like he was offering advice instead of a warning. I stepped closer, close enough to smell the metal and his aftershave mixing in the heat. My knees complained, but I ignored them. "Funny," I said, "how secrets always seem to belong to the woman in the family." His smile slipped for just a second. He looked at the door again, then at me, and something uneasy crossed his face. Maybe it was the way I wasn't rushing. Maybe it was the silence. The camera light blinked on and off behind him, unnoticed. "What's inside?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just met his eyes and let the quiet stretch, knowing he'd already crossed a line he couldn't see from where he stood. I felt the weight of years settle into my spine, the long habit of being underestimated, dismissed, spoken over. The air between us thickened. He shifted his feet, waiting for permission that would never come, unaware that the moment he broke the lock, the story stopped being his. A distant siren wailed somewhere in town, faint but real, and his head snapped toward the sound before he caught himself. I watched that reaction carefully. Fear always shows itself first in the smallest movements. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The warehouse stood silent behind him, holding its breath, and so did I. Whatever he thought he was taking, I knew this moment would cost him more than he imagined. The siren faded into the distance, but its echo stayed with me as I stood there, watching him shift his weight like a man who suddenly remembered other people existed in the world. That sound pulled me backward, not in time, but in understanding, straight to the day my mother introduced him as her future husband and smiled as if daring me to object. I remember the smell of her pot roast that evening, a little too salty, the way her hands shook when she set the table. He brought a bottle of wine we couldn't pronounce and talked about himself through dinner, his job, his plans, his ideas of how things should be run. When he finally looked at me, his eyes lingered too long, measuring, not admiring. I felt it then, the same quiet alarm I felt now. After the wedding, the house changed without moving an inch. Drawers were reorganized. Bills were redirected. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. He never raised his voice, which made everything worse. Control doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers suggestions and calls them common sense. My mother laughed more nervously. I learned to listen more than I spoke. He tested me in small ways. Asked why my father had left things in my name. Suggested paperwork should be simpler, centralized, handled by someone more experienced. When I didn't answer right away, he smiled, patient as if training a stubborn animal. I nodded. I said I'd think about it. Silence became my answer and my shield. What he didn't see was what silence gave me. Time to watch patterns. Time to notice how he asked the same question 3 different ways. Time to see which documents went missing and which ones came back with new notes in the margins. At night, when my joints ached and sleep came in pieces, I made lists in my head. Names. Dates. Changes. My mother tried in her way. She'd touch my arm when he left the room, whisper that he just wanted to help. I wanted to tell her help doesn't feel like pressure, that love doesn't make you smaller. But she looked tired, and I'd already lived long enough to know when truth would land like cruelty. So I stayed quiet for her too. The first time he mentioned the warehouse directly, it was casual, almost lazy. We were standing in the kitchen, sunlight slanting across the counter, dust floating like it had nowhere else to be. That old place of your father's, he said. Seems a shame to let it sit. I watched my reflection in the microwave door and said nothing. From then on it became a refrain. Little jokes about locks and keys. Questions disguised as concern. He never asked outright. He didn't need to. He believed persistence would wear me down, that age would soften my grip. Instead it sharpened it. Every comment reminded me why my father trusted me, not the world. I began keeping things in duplicate. Not hidden, just separated. One copy where it was expected. One where it was safe. I learned which afternoons he left early and which mornings he slept in. None of it felt dramatic at the time. It felt practical, like tightening a loose railing before someone fell. At family gatherings he played the generous husband. Loud laughter. Stories that painted him as the reasonable one. I watched relatives nod along, watched my mother glow under attention she hadn't had in years. I told myself this was the cost of peace. But peace, I learned, has a price that keeps increasing. Standing in front of the warehouse now, that marriage made sense in a way it never had before. This wasn't sudden. It was practiced. He'd rehearsed this moment through years of entitlement, each quiet boundary I held becoming in his mind an insult. He thought my stillness meant surrender. I took one step closer to him and felt my heart settle instead of race. Staying quiet had never meant being unaware. It meant choosing when to speak. And as he waited for my reaction, cutters hanging loose in his hand, I understood something clearly at last. This was exactly the moment I'd been preparing for, even back when I didn't know its shape. The marriage had taught me restraint the way storms teach old houses where they creak. I didn't enjoy the lesson, but I learned it thoroughly. Watching him now, waiting for me to fold the way others had, I felt a strange gratitude for every dismissed concern and swallowed protest. They had trained me to endure this stare, this pause, without breaking. Whatever came next would not be an accident. It would be the result of years of choosing quiet over chaos and patience over fear. For once. Whatever came next would not be an accident. It would be the result of years of choosing quiet over chaos and patience over fear. And that truth settled into me as I turned from him and laid my palm against the warehouse door. The metal was warm from the sun, rough under my skin, familiar in a way few things are after decades of living. This place had never been about storage or profit. It was where my father taught me how to keep records, how to trust systems more than promises, how to leave proof instead of arguments. Standing there, I could almost hear his voice reminding me not to rush. He cleared his throat behind me. "You always were sentimental," he said, trying for humor. "Buildings don't remember people." I didn't answer. I pushed the door open just enough to let the smell drift out. Old wood. Wool. Paper. It made him lean forward despite himself. Curiosity always betrayed him faster than greed. I watched his eyes move, searching for something valuable enough to justify the afternoon he'd planned. Inside, the lights came on automatically, low and steady. Not bright. Just enough. He frowned, annoyed by the lack of drama. "You could have sold this years ago," he said. "Let someone younger deal with it." "I am dealing with it," I said and stepped inside. The concrete floor held the day's heat. My knees protested, but I ignored them, focusing instead on the sound of our footsteps. 2 sets. Even. One confident, one cautious. I noticed which shelves he glanced at first and which ones he ignored completely. That told me what he thought mattered. He reached for a box without asking. I felt my shoulders tense, then relax. The lid stuck. He tugged harder. Paper slid but didn't spill. He scowled. "What is all this?" he asked. "Work," I said. He laughed, short and sharp. "Looks like clutter." That word stung more than I expected. Not because it was true, but because it was dismissive in the same way he'd dismissed my mother's routines, her collections, her careful ways. I moved past him and lifted another box easily, setting it on a table he hadn't noticed before. It wobbled slightly. I adjusted the leg. "Small corrections matter. This place is outdated," he continued. "No one needs hard copies anymore." "Some of us do," I said. As he talked, I checked my watch. The second hand moved smoothly. I listened for the faint hum overhead, the one most people never hear. It was there. Good. That answered a question I'd been carrying since last winter. He wandered deeper, impatience creeping into his movements. "You're hiding something," he said finally, not accusing, just stating what he believed was obvious. I met his eyes. "Everyone hides something." He smiled, satisfied, like he'd won a point. He didn't see how carefully the space guided him, how the layout funneled attention away from what mattered and toward what didn't. My father had called it human nature management. I'd called it common sense. A noise outside made him stiffen. A truck passing. Nothing more. Still, his confidence cracked just enough for me to notice. He checked his phone. No signal. He frowned again, this time at me. "This place is terrible for reception," he said. "I know," I replied. That was the moment he really looked at me, not as an obstacle but as a presence. Years of underestimating women does that to a man. It blinds him to preparation. He opened his mouth to say something else, then stopped when he noticed the small sign by the door. He squinted, reading it twice. "What's that mean?" he asked. "Instructions," I said. "For emergencies." He scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction now. He shifted his weight, glanced toward the exit, then back at the shelves. The building creaked softly, settling like it was alive enough to listen. I felt my pulse slow, steady as the lights above us. This warehouse had taught me more than patience. It taught me how to let people reveal themselves while they believed they were in control. Watching him pace, I understood something else, too. Whatever he thought he'd come to claim, he was already surrounded by things he didn't understand. And I was finally done explaining myself to anyone who mistook quiet for empty. I rested my hand on the table again, feeling the vibration beneath my skin, and let the moment stretch. He waited for me to speak, for permission, for reassurance. I gave him none. Outside, the afternoon light shifted, shadows lengthening across the floor. The door stood open behind us, but the space between him and leaving felt suddenly complicated, and I could see him realizing that too. I stayed and let that realization grow. Watching his confidence drain in small, almost polite ways that only someone paying attention would notice. He started pacing, slow at first, then quicker, as if movement alone might shake loose whatever he felt slipping away. His boots scraped the floor, leaving faint marks in the dust, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not satisfaction. Something steadier. The kind of calm that comes when you stop hoping people will surprise you and accept that they won't. "You're enjoying this," he said finally, trying to sound amused. "No," I replied. "I'm observing." That irritated him more than anger would have. He preferred reactions he could push against. Silence left him nowhere to lean. He picked up a clipboard from a hook, flipped through pages he didn't understand, then tossed it back like it offended him. "This is a waste of time," he muttered. I leaned against the table, feeling its solid edge press into my hip. My legs needed the support, but I didn't let that show. "You're free to leave," I said, knowing he wouldn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again, tapping the screen harder this time. "Nothing." He turned in a slow circle, holding it up, searching for bars like a divining rod. Unbelievable, he said. In this day and age. It's intentional, I said before I could stop myself. His head snapped up. What is? I met his gaze and shrugged. Just enough truth to unsettle him, not enough to explain. He stared at me longer than he had all afternoon, really looked as if trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the one standing in front of him now. The gap between those two ideas made him uneasy. A faint sound cut through the room. Not loud. Easy to miss. He frowned. What was that? Probably nothing, I said, though I knew better. He moved toward the door, then hesitated, glancing back at the shelves as if they might lunge at him. That made me almost smile. Almost. I remembered how often he'd stood in my mother's kitchen, taking up space, talking over her stories, deciding where things should go. Now the space wasn't yielding to him and he didn't know how to handle it. You set this up, he said suddenly. Not accusing. Realizing. I felt my heart thump once hard, then settle again. I maintained it, I corrected. He laughed too loud, the sound bouncing off the walls. You think you're smarter than me? I think I'm older, I said. There's a difference. That landed. He rubbed his face, dragging his hand down like he was wiping away sweat or doubt. I couldn't tell which. When he spoke again, his voice dropped. We're family, he said. This doesn't have to get messy. Family. He used the word like a tool, not a bond. I thought of my mother sitting at the dining table, folding napkins that didn't need folding, adjusting to make room for him. I thought of how many times I'd swallowed words to keep the peace. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It clarified. I didn't make it messy, I said. You did. Another sound, closer this time. A low hum shifting into something sharper. He turned toward the ceiling, then toward the door, his eyes wide now. What did you do? He asked. I didn't answer. I checked my watch instead, a habit I'd picked up over the years. The second hand moved. The world continued. He started talking again, faster now, words piling on top of each other. Explanations. Justifications. Promises. He offered solutions I hadn't asked for and apologies he didn't mean. I listened, nodding once, twice, like I was considering it. Inside, my thoughts were steady. I felt the weight of my age in my bones and the strength of it in my spine. Waiting had never been passive. It had been deliberate. A shadow crossed the doorway. Then another. He saw it this time. His face went pale, the color draining like water from a sink. He looked at me, really looked, and something like understanding flickered there, too late to be useful. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. I straightened, pushing away from the table. I didn't do anything, I said, and meant it more than he could know. The sounds outside grew clearer, voices overlapping, footsteps approaching. He took a step back, then another, like retreat might undo what had already started. I stood my ground. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't angry. I felt present in my body in a way I hadn't in years. As the door began to fill with other people, other authority, other consequences, I watched him realize that every choice he'd made had led him here without my interference. He had cut the lock himself. He had crossed the line alone. All I'd done was stay quiet long enough to let him show exactly who he was. I stood my ground. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't angry. I felt present in my body in a way I hadn't in years. Even as the first uniformed officer stepped fully into the doorway. Everything slowed, like the air itself had thickened. The officer looked from him to me, then at the broken lock outside, the open door, the scattered papers. My stepfather opened his mouth first, of course. He always did. Words poured out of him, fast and messy, a story stitched together from confidence and panic. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded, my pulse steady. When the officer turned to me, I answered simply. I gave my name. I explained ownership. I pointed out what had been altered, what had been forced, what no one had permission to touch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth has weight when you let it stand on its own. Another officer arrived. Then someone from the county. Questions followed, clear and methodical. He tried to interrupt again, but they waved him quiet this time. Watching that happen felt strange. Not triumphant. Just final. Like a door closing softly instead of slamming. They walked him outside while paperwork was reviewed. I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against the table, feeling the vibration in my legs slowly fade. For years, I'd imagined confrontation as something loud and dramatic. Instead, it was procedural, calm, almost gentle, that felt more powerful than anger ever could. While they talked, I noticed details I hadn't before. A crack in the concrete I'd meant to fix. A smudge on the window where my father's hand must have rested years ago. Life doesn't pause for justice. It keeps leaving marks, waiting for you to notice. My mother arrived later, her car pulling in crooked the way it did when she was nervous. She looked smaller standing there, hands clenched in her purse, eyes darting between us. He started talking again, softer now, pleading. She didn't step toward him. She looked at me instead. I didn't know, she said. I know, I replied. And I meant it. What came out, piece by piece, wasn't just about the warehouse. It was about papers he'd filed without consent. Accounts he'd tried to access. Stories he'd told that didn't match records. The building had never been just a building. It was proof. Of ownership. Of boundaries. Of trust honored instead of ignored. An official asked if I wished to press forward. The wording was careful, respectful. I felt my age then not as weakness but as clarity. I nodded. Yes, I said. I do. As they led him away, he glanced back once, his face tight with disbelief. He'd expected a fight. He'd expected tears. He hadn't expected silence to outlast him. I met his eyes and felt nothing sharp at all. Just release. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the concrete. One of the officers handed me a card and spoke gently, like he understood this wasn't just paperwork. Thanked him. My voice didn't wobble. After they left, the lot grew quiet again. Wind moved through dry weeds along the fence. My mother and I stood side by side without touching. Finally she sighed, long and tired. I don't know who I am without him, she said. You'll remember, I told her. You always do. She nodded slowly as if testing the idea. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. Some understanding happens without arms around it. I watched her drive away, slower than she'd arrived, like someone learning a new route, unsure but willing. I remained there a while after she left, letting the quiet settle. The warehouse no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a boundary that had finally held. Later, alone, I locked the warehouse properly. The new lock slid into place with a solid click that echoed inside my chest. I walked through the aisles slowly, touching shelves, breathing in the familiar smell. My knees ached. My back protested. But I felt upright in a way age can't take from you. I thought of every time I'd stayed quiet to survive, and how silence had finally spoken for me. I understood then that survival had slowly turned into strength, without me noticing the exact moment it happened. I hadn't taken revenge with shouting or cruelty. I hadn't needed to. What I took back was authority over my own life. The right to be underestimated no longer. I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me, carrying with me something far more valuable than property. I carried peace, earned the hard way, and I didn't set it down for anyone ever again, not now, not later, not for any man. If this story spoke to you, you're not alone. Subscribe for more real, emotional stories about strength, betrayal, and quiet revenge, because some of us didn't get louder, we got smarter.